Good evening.
Who are these people?
Welcome.
I think it'll be okay.
Welcome to Who Wants to Be a Trillionaire? The Ethics of Extreme Wealth. I will avoid any jokes about this being a self-help session, and I will not direct you to look under your seat for any earnings you may get out of this panel. I'm Eric Bierbaum, Director of the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today. I'd like to begin by thanking our event co-sponsor, the FAS Civil Discourse Initiative. Their support has enabled us to expand this worthwhile series to the wider audience. These events began at the Ethics Center in 2019 as a new series of moderated civil disagreement discussions to bring together policy and subject experts who hold different political viewpoints on urgent current events. Our goal has been to model thoughtful, reflective engagement on hard issues with the firm belief that we have much to learn from opposing perspectives. The conversation aims to better understand the panelists' different perspectives on these issues, given their experiences, beliefs, and values that animate them. We'd like to extend a special thank you and welcome to our Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership, the ICDP Fellows. These fellows are participating from the California State University, Bakersfield, Harvard University, Stanford University, St. Philip's College in San Antonio, Texas, and we spend a special welcome and our thoughts to the ICDP Fellows at Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida, as they and the rest of their state deal with the impact of Hurricane Milton. This partnership began and is committed to advancing fundamental democratic commitments to freedom of expression, equality, and agency. For the full academic year, these fellows worked together across 5 campuses, building the skills needed to have hard conversations and learn how to facilitate these discussions for others. I'd also like to welcome our Fellows in Values Engagement, known as the 5. They're the folks in the room wearing burgundy vests, their new swag. The 5 workshops best practices and facilitates productive undergraduate student conversations, and through post-lecture dinners like tonight's and original programming in our residential communities. I encourage all undergrads in the audience to look for the Values Engagement Fellows on your way out in the lobby upstairs and join them for follow-up discussions at local restaurants. Before I turn the floor over to our guests, a few things to note. We strongly encourage you to enter questions on the Q&A feature as they occur to you. There's no need to wait until the end to do so. We'll get as many questions as we can, and the in-person audience can access the Q&A using the QR code sheet handed to you at the door. Our live stream audience can find the Q&A link in the description below your viewing window. We've added live audience polling in this app, so please share your thoughts in the polling section as well. And now I'm pleased to welcome our moderator and panelist. Moderator Chris Robichaux is Senior Lecturer in Ethics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Director of Pedagogy and Civil Disagreement at the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. Jessica Flanagan is the Richard L. Morrill Chair of Ethics and Democratic Values at the University of Richmond. Tom Mollison is an Associate Professor of Social Justice and Peace Studies at King's University College, Western University. Shruti Ragapalayan is a Senior Research Fellow for Indian Political Economy and Emergent Ventures, India at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Nyinhe Se is the Kim B. Clark Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. With that, Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. Really excited to get into our conversation today. I'm going to start the best way possible. I read something on the internet, right, isn't it? But I did read something on the internet.
Must be true.
Right? Here we are. It's a terrible start already. That said that Elon Musk may be positioned to become the first trillionaire that the world has ever had. And personal feelings about Elon Musk himself aside, I thought that this would be a great opportunity, a question to pose to you, to give each of you a chance to sort of develop your position and how you would approach this. Many people hear the idea that there would be a trillionaire as something that advertises a kind of injustice. There's something unjust about a world that produces trillionaires. Others think there's no problem with this whatsoever, we should celebrate it. And then, of course, there's a variety of things in between. So, Shruti, I'm going to start with you to wrestle with this first question. What should we think about a world maybe right around the corner that has trillionaires?
Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be here. Thanks, everyone. I think for me, the first question would be how they got to being a trillionaire. And I think that's quite important. So if you look at sort of the long arc of history, up till the Industrial Revolution, the richest people in the world, the trillionaires of their day, were all conquerors and warriors and kings who either got it through expropriation, plunder, taxation, and so on. And it's only in the post-Industrial Revolution period that we get into this entire idea and have to grapple with people earning their wealth in a single lifetime, right? And that's relatively recent. So, I mean, we're at Harvard, and some of these ideas come from Nozick, of course, and the question is, did they acquire it fairly? Was it non-coercive? Was it through voluntary transfers? And so on and so forth. So I think to me, there's a very big difference between Genghis Khan and Elon Musk, if not on any other margin, at least how they acquired their wealth, right? The second is, most folks in the modern world, they, especially, I was just looking at the list of the top 20 wealthiest people in the world, most of their wealth comes from their stock, which means they got wealthy also making other people wealthy, right? If Elon Musk is wealthy, it's every single school teacher out there whose retirement is invested in one of these funds, which gets, sort of bigger and starts compounding because the 20 wealthiest people out there are pushing very hard, not just to increase their own wealth, but also to increase the wealth of everyone else. So I think on these margins is where I think I see the most difference and pushback. So we do need to make a difference about how they receive their wealth. Now, another thing is, I think it's important to be a little bit self-aware while we're talking about this. The difference between Elon Musk and everyone else may seem very large, but if we define extreme wealth as, say, the top 1% of the world's wealthiest people, that threshold is under $1 million US. Right? Most people in this room grew up in households that had the net worth of about that much. So if we talk about you vis-a-vis the rest of the world, all of you belong to the extremely wealthy. I don't know how comfortably that sits with you. If we think about it as the top 0.1%, the threshold in the United States is about 25 million. Right? If you take the global, I'm sure most people at Harvard Business School would think that's a reasonable amount of money that they should aim for if they started a business venture or something like that, right? I'm sure you get contributions that are larger than 25 million to the endowment. And yet, that's just the top 0.1% of Americans. So if you look at it compared to the rest of the world, most of you, however you feel about Elon Musk, I think you have to account for the fact that most of the world may feel that way about you. So how do we grapple with that? Do you think you're doing good in the world by, producing all the research, all the ideas, all the entrepreneurship, and so on? And the last thing that actually made me, when I was digging into the internet to look at who are the extremely wealthy, of the top 20th wealthy people in the world, only a couple of people have inherited their wealth. And that's, again, something that's quite remarkable. So I know it seems like someone might make $1 trillion and we live in the most unequal of times, but actually, we live in a time where most of these folks grew up relatively upper middle class. And none of the Americans on the top 20 wealthiest list actually inherited their wealth. They're all, the first one on that list is Mukesh Ambani, who comes from India, which is where I grew up. And he inherited part of his company. Of course, he grew it after that. And the others are in Europe and Latin America and so on. So in a sense, this is a little bit like the Dickensian, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. But it's actually not such a terrible thing to be extremely wealthy in the day and age that we are in today. Just because of how most of the extreme wealth has been acquired. And it's almost always through the market process and almost always enriching others along with themselves.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Tom, please.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the Center of Ethics for putting this on. Yeah, so it's a good question. I think a world with billionaires and even more with trillionaires is a deeply unjust world, because I think that inequality at that level is a form of cancer on society. It's deeply poisonous, it's deeply toxic, it's deeply harmful. So the way I approach these issues and encourage other people to approach these issues is to think in concrete comparative terms. Like, what are our alternatives? So one alternative is the status quo, a world with billionaires and maybe, God forbid, trillionaires too. And then a feasible, realistic alternative, of course, is that we tax the rich. We have high income taxes, we have wealth taxes, and we redistribute that money to poor people across the globe and at home. And so I think then what you need to do, the sensible way to approach this question is ask what are the pros and cons in those worlds. And so there are many deep problems of inequality. I'll come back to a number of them over the course of this evening, but let me very quickly just mention what I see as the top 5, which are that inequality is irreconcilable with democracy. When the rich have so much resources that inevitably and inherently undermines the idea of equal political influence. Second, gross inequality is devastating for the environment and environmental sustainability. The top 1% emit the same amount of carbon as 5 billion human beings. Right? The very worst thing you can do for the environment is have a trillionaire. And really, the worst thing you can do for the environment is have trillionaires. The best thing you could do is to get rid of those trillionaires by redistributing their wealth, particularly if you redistribute it to green technology and things like that. The third problem with inequality, I mean, maybe I should have mentioned this, the first one is that when wealthy people hoard such enormous resources, that means that that money cannot go to other places where it is desperately needed. We have absolutely vital, urgent needs in the world. 15,000 children die every single day in the world from poverty. 15,000 children. In my view, that is the single greatest moral catastrophe in our world. I think it's completely awful and absurd that there's money for these people. It's just all being held and hoarded by a tiny number of elites. And similarly at home, there's 500,000 Americans that are homeless, right? There's millions of people who lack health insurance, who are economically insecure. We could cure these problems so easily if it wasn't hoarded by the wealthy. So that's the third problem. The fourth problem with inequality is that societies that are more unequal, societies that have lower taxes, also tend to have much more economic insecurity. And this matters because the evidence is very clear to show that economic insecurity breeds far-right populism, it breeds xenophobia, it breeds racism, and breeds fascism. Economic insecurity isn't the only element, right? Right-wing populism is a complicated phenomenon, but the evidence is clear that economic insecurity is an important motor of that. And so societies that have extreme inequality tend to promote that, and that's very scary when we think of the fact that neo-Nazi parties are getting more support now than at any time since the 40s. The fifth reason that inequality, and this is the last one I'll mention, is that inequality is terrible for community well-being. You should think of inequality as like a ripping of the social fabric. It tears community apart. And so once again, the evidence is overwhelming to show that inequality is bad for mental health. Inequality is bad for crime. Inequality is bad for trust. Inequality is bad for corruption. So inequality is devastating for society in all kinds of ways. So that's one side of the question. What would happen if we raised taxes on the rich and redistributed that? Hopefully we could get into this more tonight, but there would, I think, be some cost to doing that. However, when you look at the evidence of what are the costs of high taxes on the rich, I don't think it would impact incentives really at all. There is some minor question about whether it would impact private investment rates, but in general, I think those would be more or less balanced out by public investment. We can, haggle at the margin, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that having really high taxes on the rich and spending that money on public services may have some costs. There might be some costs there for sure, but they're going to be minor. Okay? Whereas the other side of the coin, the costs of inequality are orders of magnitude larger. Environmental destruction, mass death from poverty, right-wing populism, and fascism. So in my mind, that's how you compare these things, right? On the side of inequality is a very scary world that could be made much better. And I think there are much fewer costs and really just much greater benefits for taxing the rich really high and using those resources to guarantee every human being has the material and cultural conditions they need to live good and flourishing lives.
Thank you so much, Tom. Jess, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jess. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really agree with what Trudy was saying about it really matters what kind of billionaires we're talking about, how they got their money. I think it's helpful for the purpose of this conversation to just focus on market-made billionaires So the kinds of people who are making money through innovation and investment. So that's like the Steelman case. No one's going to defend the bad billionaires. We're all going to defend the market-made millionaires. And my position is it's not really the inequality that we should be focused on when we think about whether or not an economic distribution is just. Instead, we should focus on material conditions of the worst off in terms of their actual deprivation. And it is true, as Tom was saying, that there is a lot of material deprivation in the world. But there's a lot less of it than there has been at any time in human history. And why? What has been so beneficial for the poor in America, for the global poor? Economic development. That's the thing that's like lifted so many people out of poverty. And so we really want to be reluctant about supporting any kind of policy that's going to in any way hinder economic development, because economic development has been so good for the worst off. So I agree that like poverty, global poverty especially, is a really pressing moral concern. However, it doesn't follow from that we ought to be taxing billionaires. For one reason, consider a kind of internal contradiction to the argument for taxing billionaires. On one hand, people who want to tax billionaires say, billionaires are so bad because they're corrupting our democracy. How are they corrupting our democracy? Oh, public officials are so corrupt that they're just going to sell out and do a bunch of bad stuff for these billionaires who are influencing them. We can't trust public officials at all. And like, oh, why else are billionaires bad? Oh, billionaires are also really bad because then Democratic voters might be radicalized, or they become like far-right Nazis, and like via the democratic process, like they're going to control what public officials do and stuff. It's like, okay, great. Like, so public officials are like both influenced by unscrupulous billionaires and also far-right Nazis. So like, okay, that's our premise here. So what's the solution? Oh, we should empower public officials to take a bunch of money from billionaires so that then they can control that money instead. So the billionaires are investing their money in companies, in the market, in things that are, promoting economic growth and innovation, which is good for the global poor, good for people in general. But instead, we should take that money out of their hands and give it to these unreliable, corrupt, undemocratic public officials who we're stipulating the public officials are because that's the reason that we're worried about billionaires and democracy. So there's a kind of internal contradiction to the case for taxing billionaires when it comes to what standards we're holding, behavioral standards we're holding our public officials to. Now, maybe that's like too harsh on public officials, maybe like they're all good-hearted and stuff. Nevertheless, they're structurally incentivized in countries to benefit people in their own political community. But as Shruti was saying, people in our political community are among the richest people. And the people with the most urgent material needs are the global poor or future generations who are affected by things like climate change. So if we look at where billionaire philanthropy is going, often billionaire philanthropy is going towards global poverty reduction or climate change. Additionally, billionaires are focused on innovations such as energy infrastructure reform, which are going to be the most promising interventions to solve problems of sustainability right now. So because billionaires have market incentives to focus on innovating for more efficient energy distribution, and because when they do invest in philanthropic causes like the Gates Foundation, they focus on global poverty, and because they're generally participating in economic development, those are all presumptive reasons to think that billionaires are helpful towards the global poor and more reliably going to be beneficial to those people than public officials who are beholden to people in their own political community, often who are not the most materially badly off people. Now, maybe you still don't like that there are billionaires, but good news. There's like, I think probably around 1,000 billionaires, maybe a little bit fewer in the United States. There are not many billionaires. We fixate on billionaires and we think like, oh, it's so bad for community or whatever. But the real kind of inequality that is bad for you is not the inequality between you and Jeff Bezos. It's the inequality between you and your neighbor who just got a Volvo when you're driving a Hyundai Santa Fe. Like, that is the kind of inequality that really like gets to people in their heads. It's inequality within their peer group. And so I don't think that I have like, sustained interactions with Jeff Bezos where like my own social basis of self-respect is undermined by the presence of him. And if anything, he's really benefited me because I love buying stuff on Amazon. And we've all benefited from billionaires in all of these ways through their contributions to economic growth. So instead of focusing on billionaires, I think instead we should focus on thinking about how do we support economic development and innovation. And when we think about those things, economic development and innovation, that's what's really going to materially improve the circumstances the worst off. It turns out that economic development and innovation, the kind of society that produces that is also going to be the kind of society that produces billionaires. But that's a good thing. That there are billionaires in your society is a sign of a healthy, growing society where people have incentives to provide goods and services that are valuable to people that they voluntarily want to buy, unlike whatever goods and services public officials are doing where they didn't secure the consent of any of the people who are subject to their authority.
Thanks so much, Jess. Ninha.
Has a lot to react. Should I react to what people are saying?
You can begin reacting, but we'll also want you to sort of share your how you would approach a question like the emergence of trillionaire.
The precise phrasing of the question is, who wants to be a trillionaire?
The question is right. Well, the question is, with the emergence of trillionaires, is this yet another signal of a deep economic injustice?
In our world today, given the institutions that we have, I would say the answer is yes. I have to say more.
I was about to say, all right, well then, it's been
Thank you.
awesome.
Thanks so much.
So
Great.
much.
Yes. Mic drop. Oh, game over. No, look. I mean, look, here, let's start with the questions. Could you imagine a society or a set of institutions in which it would be perfectly just for there to be trillionaires? Okay. We could probably try to imagine such a system, but it has along with it a lot of features to it. It probably has features with regard to ensuring that people's basic needs are met across all of society. It probably has features that ensure that the fact of great inequality doesn't lead to the corruption of public officials or lead to the ripping of the democratic fabric. Or it must have features in which the ways in which people earn their money is in fact considered fair and just under that system. So I think we could imagine a system. Now maybe Tom, you might say, no matter how you do it, it's hard to imagine because it's just fundamentally corrosive given the human nature. I'm open to that possibility, but suppose for the moment we can imagine a system, okay? But whatever that system is not the system we have today. And so then the question, in the system we have today, is it just for there to exist such inequality? And I'm not so sure because we don't have the kind of system in which actually having that kind of inequality would be just. Now, you could then say, given the existing rules of the game, given the market and things like that, the people who earn $1 trillion are perfectly entitled to that $1 trillion. Now, I'm open to that possibility too. But then you have to ask yourself, what's the argument for then saying that they're entitled to that? Then we can sort of go into that discussion. Because then it's not clear to me, because it's not a just society that sort of makes them entitled to it, simply something along the lines of they're playing by the existing rules of the game that entitles them to that. Then the question is that reason enough to sort of grant them a claim to their $1 trillion? Maybe it is. But then you have to ask yourself the question, or I would ask myself the question, in a world of extreme need, granted the living standards are better, and granted that the work of trillionaires is making people off, let's grant that for the argument. I don't know, I just feel like, isn't there just something unseemly or untoward? It may not be unjust, but it's just something like, does it reflect, what does it say about you that you want to be a trillionaire without doing anything for other people? I'm not saying you're not entitled to it. I'm not saying it's unjust. I'm just asking the question. And that's why we have the idea of noblesse oblige. That's why we have we're sitting in a museum that's donated by the Sacklers. Right, so there are ways in which people could spend that money to maybe address those kinds of issues, but I want to separate out all those kinds of questions that we're talking about, I guess. And that for me, I just raise those questions because I want to make sure we're operating at these different kinds of levels. One is the question of impact on democracy. One is the question of what kind of system would allow that to be, just. Under the current system, what's the entitlement to people? And then what do people want to do? I mean, Warren Buffett wants to pay more taxes, and he can't.
Shruti, let me have you start responding to this. So now we'll start sort of interrogating these different views. I heard a distinction that Ninha just introduced, and toss your way and then take it any way you want. Said maybe a trillionaire who does not inherit it but earns it through market like you were pointing to, maybe what they have is not unjust, what they've earned is not unjust, but it might be unseemly or untoward, right? And I thought, I heard you sort of respond to that, and so I thought you may want to jump in and take that and run with
just
it. Yeah.
maybe in the order in which some of the remarks were made. You know, I often hear that there's this concern about trillionaires, or like billionaires, since we don't have a trillionaire, on democracy. And, you know, Michael Bloomberg actually spent $1 billion on a presidential campaign that could have been timed with an egg timer. I mean, we don't even think of it. We don't remember any of this. And it was $1 billion. And I was looking this up. I was like, am I misremembering it because no one mentions this? But he spent about $1 billion and about 500 million just on all kinds of advertising, at the end of which the only territory he won on Super Tuesday is the American Samoa, right? So I feel like we have this fear about, and neither party wanted him, right? To think about, oh, these, you know, political vultures who want to get the richest people to come in. So I feel like this idea of, you know, a handful of trillionaires controlling democracy seems to be a bit overblown. Is money in politics complicated? And do we need to look at how we think about our campaign finance? Do we need to think about how crony capitalism affects what's going on in Congress? Sure. But a handful of people sort of, you know, as puppet masters, I'm trying to find the evidence for it, and I don't see the richest people even getting nominated, let alone win, right? So I think that's something we need to think about. Tom said something really important about, you know, the fraction of the top 1% taking up all, I mean, being responsible for all the emissions and so on. But what if the richest person in the world got rich building green climate technology, which is not a thought experiment? I mean, literally, Elon Musk is not rich because of Tesla stock, not rich because of Twitter stock, on which I think he's making a loss. It's because of Tesla stock, right? So I think it's a little bit more complicated. And my fear with the ways by which we address inequality and we sort of, you know, tax and redistribute is it also going to have unintended consequences on startups that are working on green technologies and climate technologies and so on. And on the last point about the, you know, it may not be unjust, but it's unseeming or untoward, I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. So I don't think we're close to getting the first trillionaire. And the reason is, as people get richer, they tend to diversify, right? So Bill Gates, I mean, sometimes the diversification happens because of family and divorce and things like that. And sometimes it also happens because people just decide that they've had enough of Microsoft or Amazon and they need to have a more diverse portfolio, spend some more time boating or fishing or whatever it is. I think the unseemly part of it is because the richest people tend to make all their bets in one basket. And they put it on what they truly believed in and the company that they founded. So they are also incredibly high in their sort of risk profile, which makes it seem like, oh, this person made a bet that seemed pretty normal, and now suddenly it's paid off in such an extraordinary way. We're seeing that with NVIDIA right now, right? This was a company that's existed for a couple of decades, and now suddenly, out of nowhere, you know, you have one person who seems to be climbing the rankings of the richest people. We made them rich, right? The reason NVIDIA stock is climbing up is because I was in India just a few hours ago, less than 24 hours ago. It's because I have the guy who's driving the Uber or the taxi using AI translation software on his phone to communicate with me if I say something in English. And that's the reason that NVIDIA stock is going up. And it's very hard to divorce these two and only look at the one part of it where everyone's gone all in on the risk and say that seems a bit untoward or unseemly without looking at like the more complex play that's happening throughout the world that's actually made the people rich. I think he wants to react, so I'll stop now.
Neha, did you want to respond to that?
I didn't mean unseemly in that you made your money. I guess I meant unseemly as like sort of just what you're not doing with your money. I guess that's all it was. Sort of this idea of like sort of just not doing, not using it to sort of benefit. That was a question. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's the case. I'm sort of asking that something. I just want to distinguish the kinds of reactions people might have to these sorts of things, right? So the unseemliness is not about how you make your money. It's more just like, it seems like unseemly that in a world of extreme poverty, somebody could ask, well, seems to sort of like, shouldn't you like help alleviate poverty with your money? I mean, this is the question. That's just the question.
Why do you think that billionaires aren't trying to help people? Because I think that sometimes we do this thing where it's like we think if someone else is making money that there's like not a good motive behind it or something. But like you can tell that like they've benefited a lot of people because a lot of people paid them for the goods and services that they were providing.
Excellent.
And that is a sign that they valued it.
Perfect, that's right. But here's the question. That people are willing to pay something to somebody else for that reflects certain value. And let's assume for sort of also that we don't have monopoly conditions and that so that the price that's charged is in some sense reflective of a well-functioning market. It's one thing. The question is, that's one question. But the question is, what does it take for the person who's doing the innovation to be motivated to create that innovation? Right? And many people go into entrepreneurial ventures. Some of them entrepreneurs that I know go into it because they want to create a new product. They want to make things better. Yeah. They're not in it for the money. The money just so happens to come along. And you can ask yourself, what's the difference between what you have to be paid to be motivated to do something versus how much you earn in return? And that difference is rent. There are lots of people who would be willing to do the things they do without having to be paid the money they are. And so then the question is, what do we do with that money that then they receive as a result of that? That's not needed to motivate them. That's economic rent. And the question is, what you do with rent, it depends on your theory of you're entitled to the rent because that's just the way the market works. Or you could say, no, if the reason that you need to be paid that much is that you need to be motivated to do that, that's the old Jerry Cohen question of like, well, then what should you do with the rent?
So can I follow up on this?
Yeah, and then Tom, I'm going to bring you in to tell us a little bit more about democracy and the erosion of democracy with this. Yeah.
Yeah, here's my follow-up. My favorite billionaire, Taylor Swift. We like her, right? Yeah, we all like her. All right, so she is a billionaire because she's in a market where the additional cost of production, everybody pays basically the same for any kind of a song, and so all of the consumers can kind of get their first choice because songs are so inexpensive, and so she gets massive gains from the fact that this is a market where the marginal cost of producing an additional thing is pretty low. So it's very egalitarian in a way because basically no matter what you make, if you have a Spotify subscription, you can always get your first choice, Taylor Swift, not your second choice, Kelsey Ballerini or whatever, because the artists aren't competing on price, and so then she gets massive economic gains from this superstar structure. Now we're thinking okay, that's not why she's in it. She's in it for the love of the game, right? Long live, what a song, that's what this is about. Should she invest her money where it's just in other types of businesses and productive enterprises and the S&P or whatever? Or do you think that it would be better if Taylor Swift wrote a huge check every year to the Treasury? So raise your hand if you think the tax rate should be higher. A bunch of people, right? Okay, good news for you. You can make a donation to the US Treasury right now. You can just be the change you want to see in the world and give some money to the US Treasury. And Taylor Swift can do it too. Is that the most effective charity for Taylor Swift? Would it be a good thing if that surplus that she didn't need to motivate herself, that surplus economic return that she was getting, if she just gave it to the US Treasury? If her only options are you can give it to the US Treasury or you can just put it in investments, you can put it in the market. I think it would be better for her to put it in the market. She gives it to the Treasury, she's just going to give it cash transfers to old people. It's just going to be basic income for
Let me
old
bring
people.
Tom in on this.
Yeah. So, I want to respond to this idea that the market income people make is deserved. I think that's just not true. So the income that you make is a reflection of bargaining power. And there are at least three reasons why it's not true that rich people deserve their money. The first is that we do not live in a meritocracy. There's nothing like equal opportunity in this society. The people who make a lot of money, the 1%, by and large start with all kinds of advantages. Women in this society make 49 cents to the dollar over a 15-year period. Black people have 13 times less wealth than white families. White families own 90% of this country's wealth. 50% of all wealth can be traced to inheritance. Poor kids go to schools in New York that cost $8,000 per student. Rich kids go to private schools that get $80,000 per student. Right? Going to Ivy Leagues costs 88 grand. The median income in this country is 40 grand. We know that children of the rich are 75% more likely to go to university than children of the poor. There is nothing like a meritocracy. To think that there is, that rich people deserve their income, is to invisibilize the history of colonialism, of slavery, of patriarchy that has shaped the institutions that exist today. So the second reason that rich people don't deserve their income is because if you look at who the rich are, like look at the top 10 richest people in the world, as Shriti said earlier, they are all major shareholders or CEOs of companies. That means they are essentially captains of the pirate ship, which is a modern corporation that makes money through mass exploitation, domination, and destruction of the environment. Right? What a contemporary corporation is a political legal structure that denies workers any say in their company. It's a fundamentally undemocratic enterprise. And so look at them. So you mentioned Amazon as Bezos benefits me. Well, I don't think the workers who work there feel that. Bezos crushes unions. He took away healthcare from his part-time workers. Or look at some other examples. Steve Jobs, Apple. Right? Apple makes its products in Foxconn, China, whereas when Bezos was making billions of dollars, his workers were literally committing suicide by throwing themselves out of their windows. Or the Walton family, Walmart. Right? They're known for crushing unions, for not letting their cashiers sit down. Elon Musk makes many of his cars in Shanghai factories where the workers are forced to work 12 hours a day, 6 hours a week. Sorry, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's exploitation. So I think it's wrong to think that this money is somehow clean and pure. I think that totally invisibilizes the fact that we live in a white supremacist patriarchal society, and that comes through. Let me just say one more thing quickly about income. This is the most kind of philosophical thing, and it's also going to be the thing that I'm going to say is going to be the most controversial, which is that I don't think rich people or actually any of us deserve our income because all of our talents, and I'm thinking of here like people like Taylor Swift's angelic voice, are intertwined with luck. She does have a beautiful voice. I love Taylor Swift. But does she deserve that voice? None of us choose our personality. None of us choose our character. None of us choose whether we wake up in the morning with energy and excitement and gumption or with chronic fatigue or pain or ADHD. We are who we are because of luck, the luck of genes and circumstance. That's what it is to be human. It's to be a concatenation of circumstance. It's to be a infleshed swirl of chemical contingency. It's luck. And so because it's luck, I think it's deeply unfair. Rawls would say it's arbitrary from a moral point of view to benefit some people who are lucky, have more productive bodies, and to punish people who have unproductive bodies. It's arbitrary. It's like saying, because these people have white skin, they should have more money. Or because these people have blue eyes, they should have more money. If you have a more productive body, you have Michael Phelps's wingspan or Taylor Swift's voice, like, good for you, but that's luck. So I think as a society, we should, I think when you think of meritocracy deeply, at its heart, it's a doctrine of ableism. It's a prejudice doctrine that says people should be rewarded for factors that are outside of their control, and people should be punished, particularly disabled people should be punished for their lack of productivity that's out of their control. I think that's an abhorrent philosophy. So I know that's like, deservingness is deeply rooted in our culture. We're not gonna abandon it anytime soon, but I think we should try to move away from a culture that thinks and talks so much about what he or she or they deserve because of the accidents of their body and focus more on what people need to live good lives. So Howard Zinn said, give people what they need. Give them food, give them medicine, give them clean air, give them pleasant houses, some hours of work, more hours of leisure. Don't ask who deserves it, because every human being deserves it. To me, that's the right moral principle of moving away from talk of deservingness, because it's so arbitrary about what our bodies can do, and focusing more on what we need.
Shruti, you want to respond to some of what you've heard?
Yeah, so, you know, the reason I think this is so complicated, and I don't think you have to go into whether individuals, I mean, there's a certain birth accident for all of us, but I don't even think you need to go that far. I want to focus a little bit on the fix. So Tom, you were talking about the the basic needs that need to be met. There are children who are starving, even in the United States, which is frankly unseemly, given how rich this country is.
Unjust?
And
Is it just seemly that people don't have homes?
It's unjust and unseemly.
Okay, thank you.
But at the same time, I think now you're getting yourself entangled, because one of the things that Walmart does is makes things extremely cheap. The poorest families in the United States want to shop at Walmart. And the reason they want to shop at Walmart is because the prices are going to be the best, right? A single mother, your stereotypical single mother trying to feed her children, trying to have very difficult hours at her job, can walk into a Walmart and get all the basics relatively cheaper than pretty much anywhere else. So now we are getting into some seriously complicated territory. You start pushing Walmart and you start punishing them for their policies. Sometimes maybe it's they don't let their cashier sit down. I don't know if that's entirely true, but for the sake of the argument, I'll go with unfair labor conditions. But they have more consumers than they have employees, and a lot of these consumers also tend to come from the poorest sort of deciles of the economy. It is not so simple to just say we're going to tax Walmart and then redistribute it to those folks, because then that solution has to be better. So then we're assuming now, very much in the realm of central planning, that there is a bureaucrat or a central allocation plan which can provide those same loaves of bread, right, cans of milk, cheaper to the consumers of Walmart after having accounted for whatever the labor disparity is. And that has been done before and hasn't worked pretty much anywhere in the world. I've grown up in socialism, and I can tell you that usually the public bureaucrat doing this, the only thing that is guaranteed is long lines and shortages, right? So this is an uncomfortable reality we need to think about once we go into meddling with what is the non-market solution that is going to be chosen. And I don't have an easy answer for it, but I can tell you that I haven't yet found something that is better at allocating scarce resources, right? Now, getting into the question of do we deserve to be here, and do you all deserve to be at Harvard? I'm not entirely sure, right? Tom says no, and do any of us deserve to be anywhere that we are, right? So that's a bigger question. But no matter which way you slice that, we still have to figure out who gets the bread and how does the bread reach them. And for that, I haven't found anything better than the market process and the price system.
Jess, I know that you wanted to jump in here real quick, and then Ninha, I'm going to kick it over to you and some of your reactions from what you've heard.
Yeah, so I just want you to think of whether or not we're holding everybody to the same standards of behavioral idealization. So what I mean by that is people are saying, oh, these billionaires, they're only out for the bottom line. They're exploiting their workers. But public officials, Tom said that, but public officials, they will beneficently care for the poor and vulnerable. Okay, so where does the federal budget go? About a quarter of it is Social Security, cash transfers to people who are old. Then we've got Medicare, healthcare for older people, interest on the debt, Medicaid, which does not obviously reliably extend people's lives or even really improve their health on some analyses, the Department of Defense, and then Veterans Affairs. Okay, we're pretty far down the list. Where are we helping the global poor? We're not at all. Are we really meaningfully improving the lives of the American poor? Not obvious to me. Walmart is, I think. So public officials who are using tax revenue, which they control a budget that far outstrips any billionaire, right? The billionaire could not fund, more than a few days of what the government's doing, are redistributing things in an extraordinarily inefficient, unequal, sometimes regressive in the case of Social Security way, which is not obviously improving the material standards of the worst off. Meanwhile, the billionaires of Walmart and stuff, you might think they're doing some bad things, but also, as you're saying, people are shopping at Walmart. Now, maybe you do have objections to the labor practices for factories abroad, or the working conditions of Amazon workers, or the working conditions of Walmart cashiers. Sure. But then I would like to ask, who is doing better by those people who are the allegedly exploited workers? the billionaires who are employing them, or you, or public officials, or anybody else in there. So it is true that like people are, taking jobs which are extremely difficult, where they have a difficult time organizing and unionizing. Sure, but no one is helping them meet their basic needs to a greater extent than the person who's giving them a wage so that they can live off of it. The reason that they're in those jobs is because there's been some other kind of background failure that has led to them to have material needs that they need to meet by working for Amazon or working in a factory or working for Walmart, right? So you might be critical of the billionaires, but no one else is helping those people more than the employer that you're saying is allegedly exploiting them if you're a critic of the billionaires. And the last point I'll make about these like standards of idealization and who we're going to criticize and whether we're going to keep the books in the right way is, yeah, there's inequality of economic power, but there's also massive inequality of political power between any given citizen and public officials who have a monopoly on the power to coerce. And when people use the law to interfere with people to redistribute resources via taxation, that's importantly not voluntary in a way that's very different from when people wield economic power via voluntary mutual consensual exchange, which they both agree to. So all taxes are ultimately backed by violence, by threats of political violence. And so public officials are threatening everybody with mass violence. And so it doesn't matter whether or not people deserve it, whether it's like meritocracy, like nobody's bringing up desert. Nobody cares about like who deserves what, do we deserve our talents or whatever. Because the point is, if a person is making money and acquiring resources through voluntary exchanges, the only way that you're going to stop that in order to implement a pattern of distribution is by violently interfering with them, by threatening to lock them up in a cage if they don't give some of the money that other people freely gave them. And the violence of the state is like the real morally problematic inequality that we should be talking about. But for some reason, a bunch of people are standing for the government and saying we should have our eyes on the billionaires. Meanwhile, we all live under these mass threats of violence all the time.
So Ninha, I give you an opportunity to respond, and then Tom, I want to give you a chance also. But there's been a lot of great stuff and no doubt controversial stuff said so far, and I'm looking at the questions, and I've got 3. So this is me judging you over the glasses kind of thing. So as Ninha is, and Tom, I'm going to let them speak a little bit, but in a couple of minutes, I would like to turn the floor over to the questions here. So again, if you could use the QR codes that were passed out to populate this with some questions that you have had, it'd be great. Right. Ninha, please, yeah.
Yeah, so, well, I guess if any form of taxation represents a threat of violence on the part of the state, it's difficult for me to conceive of then as any state in any sense legitimate.
Yeah, you're on the verge of a breakthrough, Rand.
What's that? No, right. So part of, I think, what the real disagreement about is ultimately what do we believe to be, right, a legitimate form of democracy or the state. I think underlying here actually are some pretty radically different views of how it is that we ought to organize the institutions that govern how we live with one another and sort of engage with one another. I think that's what's really driving, I think, a lot of this distinction here. And I don't know if we want to go into what those differences are, but even on the most minimal kind of version of the state that you need for market exchange, there still has to be, right, the authority of the state to set some rules with regard to who respects property rights. Why is it that if I sell you something, I can't take it back? I mean, we still need rules, even in that kind of system, even in the minimal sense. But then once we grant that, then the question is, why can't we then sort of grant more? So I think that's sort of one question I think is interesting that sort of just really come out from this discussion here. I think there's some, I hadn't quite appreciated, but I think there's some pretty radically different views about what counts as a state. But if you need a state, then you probably open yourselves up to all sorts of things you do. I guess the other question is, what is the alternative? We've been talking a lot about this idea of taxing and then redistributing. As somebody here at Harvard who sort of is a good Rawlsian, I want to put forward the idea of property owning democracy. All right, it'd be interesting to talk to you, Thomas, to what you think about that, because there's an idea where you do allow for market exchange, you do allow for the private accumulation of wealth, you do allow for the private ocean of capital, but it's done in a much more broad-based way. And so all the questions about market exchange, all the questions about incentives, all the questions about sort of allowing people to sort of have some sense in which they can work over the world is another way to think about addressing these kinds of issues, but a much more egalitarian distribution of property. And so rather than thinking about sort of taxing the wealthy and then sort of redistributing it, we could imagine systems that try to ensure a broader ownership of capital, whether it's through human capital development, whether it's sort of through community ownership of capital. And those are other alternatives we should put on the table as we think about, sort of, as Shruti mentioned, sort of think about what's moving forward. Yeah, we should sort of open up the range of things we might consider as sort of ways to sort of address some of the challenges that we've been talking about.
Tom, please.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that comment. I agree. I think that's the right way to think about these questions, is what are the concrete alternatives? So let's go back to the Walmart example. So one option is you have Walmart, which exploits its workers, crushes unions, takes out dead peasant insurance policies, hoping its workers are going to die, makes its products are cheap because they're made in sweatshops in abysmal conditions. So that's one possibility. You have multimillionaires, or I don't actually know if the Waltons are billionaires, but you have very rich people coming out of exploitation. So that's one option. And the alternative isn't, I mean, maybe someone's alternative is kind of communist central planning. None of us have mentioned that. I don't know where that idea is coming from. So for me, the alternative is, in the short term, a kind of social democratic alternative. Yeah, and in the longer term, some kind of democratic market socialist alternative. But let me just spell out just the very basics of even the social democratic version would be way better, which is that Walmart has unions. Or Walmart has co-determination. That means workers are allowed to elect half the board, like happens in Germany. It would mean there are basic labor conditions, there are basic rights and regulations that are practiced that are very common in many parts of the world, particularly the Nordic countries that exist here but are much weaker. Right? That's totally possible. So it's not a question of you have to have Walmart, or all these poor people are going to be unemployed. Why? Why can't we just have rules about how these corporations work? They're unionized, and then the rich, the Waltons and the shareholders are taxed much more, and that money is spent on things like public health care, affordable housing, the basic things that people need. To me, there's nothing utopian about that at all. We have tons of examples of doing that. I think we should go much further than the Nordic countries do in terms of their tax and redistribution, but that's the alternative. Do you want a neoliberal, exploitative, harsh Walmart, or a slightly softer, slightly democratized Walmart in a caring society that raises taxes and takes as its fundamental principle that we're going to look after the fundamental rights of all? I mean, to me, the answer is so clear which one is a better society to have.
So I want us to turn to these questions. It's going to dovetail nicely into this exchange. Shruti, I'm going to give you the floor next, and we'll take it from there. So thank you there's now a lot more questions to choose from, and I'm going to jump around here. But here's one that just came in. It says, the panelist said the poorest Americans are shopping at Walmart. Shruti, I think that's you, right? But now the comment goes on, but the poorest Americans also work at Walmart. The company has benefited from government subsidies that allow them to pay so low wages. Is that truly a sustainable economic model? So take, I guess, what Tom has been saying and this comment, and maybe we can dig into working conditions of places like Walmart.
So, a couple of things. I think I've been a student in Germany. Their healthcare system's awesome, but the grocery prices are way higher. And I've been a student in the United States, and the grocery prices are amazing, right? So I think I agree with you, we don't have to get to a communist system, but when we're doing this on the margin, someone has to pay for these things, right? So Tom, when you ask the question, it's so clear that it's better to have slightly better labor conditions if it means slightly higher prices for groceries. For whom? Right? For some people, they would prefer to have the cheaper groceries. So I just want to say, I don't think, to me, the answer with making the changes on the margin and the outcome that we're going to get, normatively, it's not clear that it's always going to be better. I think it's something we need to think through quite carefully. On the broader question of Walmart and the working conditions and so on, I think we are in the tightest labor market in the United States today that we've had in decades, right? I find it extraordinary to believe that people who are working at Walmart are so completely out of options when unemployment is as low as we have it, right? I'm not saying that there aren't some practices that could be better, and I'm not saying there are other companies that don't do better. But I think complaining about the way a really large, formal American company treats its employees, it just shows how we have no awareness of what happens in the rest of the world, right? In India, in China, the sweatshops that we are talking about in such derogatory terms, I know thousands of people who would kill to work in those conditions. Because honestly, as terrible as the corporate structure seems to all of us, the informal economy is terrible, right? It's the most economically vulnerable place to be. There is no certainty or stability. Forget not letting your cashier sit down. There isn't place to stand in the informal market. So again, this is not to say that things could not be better with American corporations, but the idea that we improve these conditions and that's what's going to make people in the rest of the world better, they're actually really fighting to get these sweatshop jobs because that's such an improvement. And for most young girls in India, working at a sweatshop, the alternative is not working at a better sweatshop. The alternative is getting trafficked, right? Or their family or their extended family selling off a young girl child because they can't afford to feed her. And if she can't get work in one of these places, okay, we got to solve this some other way. And these are not anecdotal. There's mountains of evidence of what happens when sweatshops don't allow for child labor because Americans find that abhorrent, but we don't know what the alternative is for those people. So again, I'm not saying this is all a defense of Walmart. We need to cut them some slack. I'm just saying we need to have just a broader perspective on how complex the problem is. And most of the problem is poverty and deprivation. And I don't think it's going to get solved by taxing a handful of large corporates that we find so unseemly to us from this position in the Sackler building.
Jess, you wanted to jump in on this, is that right?
I would just say, to Tom's point, Sweden has more per capita billionaires than the United States.
Yeah,
That's
true.
Market economy as well. And so that the market is what is generating the wealth that can fuel a lot of those institutions that we are holding up as like the model of like the Nordic welfare state, right? Like you still need to have a market economy in order to just generate enough wealth to sustain those types of programs. It's odd to me that the question asker points out that Walmart pays low wages because government subsidies provide other benefits to workers, which are enabling Walmart to pay less. So which one is it? So on the one hand, people are complaining that taxpayers are providing benefits to people who are low income, and that's why Walmart can pay them so little. But why is that a complaint? Isn't that just the thing that the people who are criticizing Walmart wanted, was for the taxpayers to pay more money directly to the people? And so it's an odd complaint to say on one hand that Walmart should be providing like maximal benefits to these workers, at the other hand also complaining that in virtue of having tax revenue, taxpayers are supporting some of them. And also, I am against minimum wage laws and these types of regulations because it is very complicated. When we have a minimum wage floor that's kind of arbitrarily imposed in this way, which prevents what Tom's calling like the exploitation of workers, it's going to change the mix of who's working, and it's going to prevent workers who are low-skilled workers, teenagers, people with criminal records, people who are like otherwise like low ability or marginalized from competing on the basis of price. And so then there's incentives to automation or incentives to have like more high-skilled workers working, and that could exacerbate existing disparities. So if the thing that you're focused on each time is how do we materially improve the conditions of the worst off, the best thing we have to do that is a society that is a market-based society that encourages investment and innovation. That's it. It's investment and innovation. And the kind of society that produces billionaires is also the very same society that's going to materially improve the conditions of the very worst off. Now, I agree that there's like, maybe it's a bad look symbolically in some way if you have an egalitarian sympathy and you see like extreme inequality, but we shouldn't think about the kind of status hierarchy or the symbolism of it. We should just look at the material conditions of those who are the worst off, both the domestic poor and the global poor. And in both cases, you're going to want a society that produces billionaires.
So I'm going to ask another question here that I think dovetails nicely with this point. And when we first all chatted, I brought it up, and I think this can get us perhaps into a little bit more of the philosophical principles in the background here. So there's a view out there for the uninitiated called sufficientarianism, which is this idea that justice demands that everyone live a certain quality of life, and then if there's inequalities above that, those are justified. And someone wrote a question in that space here, and I'm going to add to it a little bit, and it's been voted up a couple times. So the question is, what do you perceive to be the minimum standards of living that should be provided for everyone? That's the first part of the question. What do you consider to be the minimum standards of living? I hear that in the sufficientarian spirit. What do you consider to be the minimum standards? My addition to that is, what is your preferred way to accomplish that? And just, I'm not going to start with you, but just to sort of put this, I'm going to start with Ninha, and maybe we'll move in this direction. But I do want to just, myself, as I'm hearing this, materially improving the well-being of the worst off does not equal providing them the standards of living that a sufficientarian view would want. So I am going to be interested in hearing what you're willing to do from the state or for something else to get to that level, if you think there's a demand here to do so. Ninha, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, actually, I'd love to hear actually from Jessica about that, because on her, what she said is that we really can't change anything. And so I guess I would be very interested to hear what you would do in that context, if you don't mind my asking, because right now we're sort of boxed into a very difficult space, right? Taxation is something that can't be implemented. We then, because we can't have taxation, need to have a system where people are operating in the current system and then basically permitted to make lots of money to invest in innovation, things like that, I understand. So I guess I'm trying to understand in that vision of things, I don't understand, I guess I'm trying to understand how somebody who wanted to answer the question that was put forward, what that would look like, I guess. Is that okay? Is that a fair question?
It's fair,
or not?
yeah, but also if you just, like, for you maybe, Ninha, what is the sort of the minimum
Absolutely.
standard of living? What does that look like for you?
Good. So I tend to think less of it in terms of a minimum standard of living. It's in part relative to the situation you're in, because I do believe in some degree of relative equality, and I think it's how people see one another depends upon how the overall context is, and what counts as a good life depends upon the context. So that's partly the challenge, I think. And that's partly what's complicated by having extreme inequality, because then you sort of basically then you have to ramp up the level of standard of living for everybody. So, but that's so. I guess I'd want to focus on ensuring that people have. Basic needs being met, right? Not having to work over a certain number of hours a week, right? Being able to access a certain degree of health care that provides sort of a reasonable response to one's illness and not having to, wait in line for too long. Opportunity for education. I mean, I'm not sure I'm giving a good answer to the question. But it's kind of, but it certainly isn't the standard at which a lot of people are living in the world today. I mean, that's pretty clear too, right? And so the question is, what can we do to make it better? And I guess that's, Tom's point about looking for different kinds of alternatives. And certainly I have some views of that, but I'd be interested to sort of, hear how those of you who have this other view, how that would work.
Let's make our way down the line. Jesse, you'll be next, and then
Sure.
Tom and Tracy.
So perhaps surprisingly to some people, I've defended basic income policies before my work, because though I think that there's violence in taxation, I also think there's violence in a lot of aspects of the property system, right? I think that like a lot of the way that we're upholding existing property norms, it's enforced through threats to the bodily rights of people who aren't liable to be threatened in that way by public officials. And so I don't think that like our current property system as currently constituted has like, I've got no notes. Like I've got some notes. I have some notes on the property system. There's two things that we should care about. We should care about rights and we should care about people's well-being. And it's true that the property system in general is going to violate people's rights, and then also that taxation in turn includes threats against their bodily rights as well. We should try to minimize that as much as possible. So one thing I think would be good would be, as much as possible, both for the freedom-based gains and the well-being gains, welfare benefits from public programs should be benchmarked to whatever the benefit of cash would be. So like government provision of benefits is often so very inefficient that we lose a lot of efficiency, and we should just benchmark any kinds of interventions we have to the benefit of literally just giving people the money. That's why my family and I, we give 10% of our income to what I think are like effective causes to help global poverty. And half of that 10% goes to give directly, which is just straight up cash transfers, because I think oftentimes people are in the best position to decide how to improve their own well-being by participating in the market. But then 10% of it goes to global public health initiatives, which are focused on public goods like anti-malarial bed nets or sanitation or something like that. And that's a totally legitimate role for any kind of welfarist intervention, which I think would beat the benchmark of cash, and it's like much more efficient. So I'm not saying that there's no changes. To the question of like, well, like you're giving to those, like when would it ever be enough? Like when would we be able to stop? Like the poor will always be with us, but like when is like we can stop like having redistribution? I don't even think we need to settle that, because the bottom billion have so many challenges right now that I think that any kind of sufficientarian or egalitarian framework would say that is the population that has the most morally urgent needs, and that's where we should be focusing most of our resources and attention if you're personally giving. That's one of my reasons why I'm reluctant to support higher taxes, because I don't think taxes would be going towards the bottom billion in the way that my own charitable giving does. And I also don't think that taxes are going to be used in a way that's responsible or efficient. And I think that it's totally legitimate for really, really rich people to have the same kinds of concerns. And I also kind of worry about whether or not my own charitable giving would even benefit, the bottom billion as a long-term sustainable solution, because everything we know from economic history is that the only real solution long-term is going to be reliable enforcement of formal property rights to establish a market economy that will facilitate economic development and innovation. That's it.
Tom, please.
So the question about basic needs and what do I think of sufficientarianism? Is that?
Yeah, sort of what would be the minimum standard of a well-lived life, and then what do you think is the way that we accomplish that? What are some steps to take?
Yeah, I mean, I care deeply about sufficiency. I think it's a moral blight that there are people with so little. I think everyone should have decent housing. I think everyone should have free accessible health care. I think everyone should have free accessible childcare. Everyone should have good pensions, good transport, good access to democracy, leisure time. How do we get that? I think you're not going to get there without taxation. We have a very real experiment in this country over the last 40 years of neoliberalism, of unregulated markets, and it's done terribly at providing sufficiency, right? And whereas in contrast, the empirical evidence shows that when you have higher taxes, you have less poverty, right? There's 12% of people are poor in this country versus 3% in Finland. That's because of higher taxes. It makes a difference. So I do think there's a really interesting question here about sufficiency. The issue is so how do we raise people up? So there's a kind of, the way I think of it is there's a concrete political economy question of how do you raise people up? And then there's also an interesting but kind of different philosophical question of is raising all that matters, or should we also be pushing down? That's the limitarian bit. Yeah. So in the first question, the kind of political economy question, I kind of think that if the only way to practically raise people up to have everyone having their basic needs and essential freedoms met is going to be high taxes on the rich, because that's where the money is, right? In the US, the top 1% control 40% of all wealth. So if you're going to increase the tax of GDP by 10, 20% to move the US closer to the Nordic countries, I think it should go further than that, but let's start there. Where is the money? You're not going to just tax the middle class. That wouldn't work. And even if it did, it wouldn't make any sense, right? You're going to go where the money is, which is overwhelmingly at the top. And so what that means is, I think by and large, a genuine, realistic sufficientarianism requires limitarianism. I don't think you'll actually get there without high taxes on the rich. So that's the practical answer. The philosophical question is that It's true, I think, that for many goods, things like housing, what we really should care about is lifting people up. So I agree about the sufficiency. But I don't think that's true of all goods, because some goods are relational, which means that, by definition, inherent in the good, lifting some people up requires pulling some people down because they're relational. We should think of relational goods like seesaws. The only way to move people up is by pushing them down because they're related. Democracy is the most obvious one of these. If rich people have lots of money, they're going to have more influence in the democratic system. The only way to get poor people to have more influence in the democratic system is for rich people to have less. You can't say, like, to speak of democracy, the goal has to be equality, more or less. It doesn't make sense to think of democracy in sufficientarian terms, to say, what I want for democracy is poor people to have enough, but then I'm fine with rich people having way more power than everyone else. It's not coherent. For relational goods, they're relational. So the goal needs to be not sufficientarianism, but egalitarianism. And so democracy is the most obvious example, but I also think community well-being, things like mental health, crime, corruption, also have that kind of relational aspect. So that's my kind of philosophical answer. Then generally, like, I'm on board with sufficientarianism as long as it's, bold enough. But there are some goods that I think that are relational by their nature that the goal should be egalitarian more than sufficientarian.
I think Shruti, please.
Yeah, I mean, no question that we absolutely have to increase the floor or the standard for everyone in this world, right? Not just for Americans. And the bottom billion, I would actually say the bottom 2 billion are living in conditions that are just, again, unjust entirely because of a birth accident. This is going to be not too many takers for this politically, but the single best way to improve their lot in life is to allow immigration to rich countries, right? Why is that not on the table? Or maybe that is, Tom, but there are things other than taxation which ought to be on the table that we don't even, there's mountains of evidence on this. Some of the best work actually was done at Harvard. This is, work by Michael Clemens and Lan Pritchard, and on what an extraordinary anti-poverty program immigration is, right? So I would actually say that to lift the poor, we shouldn't just look at taxation. We should actually have an entire gamut of options on the table and then go over them one by one. I will point out a slight silver lining, though. And on this, I think also the difference between me and Tom on limiting the top. When in the 13th century, I mean, it's apparently Genghis Khan died of mysterious circumstances, but in the end it was a fever, but no one could cure it, right? John D. Rockefeller died of congenital heart failure and heart disease. No one could fix that for all the wealth in the world. And yet, some of the poorest folks I know in India got their COVID vaccine around the same time as Elon Musk did, assuming he's got vaccinated. Sorry, that wasn't a political statement. I just wasn't sure. So that is an extraordinary thing when it comes to consumption inequality. And some of this is made possible by those greedy, terrible, pharmaceutical companies, but also combined with efforts of billionaires like Bill Gates and everything that the Gates Foundation is doing, the Gavi partnership that actually gets these vaccines. Now we may very soon have a malaria vaccine. And I think one of the worst things in the world is the number of poor people and children dying of malaria. I mean, this should just not exist in the world, right? And so I think there is some silver lining here that if we manage to connect more people in the world with global supply chains, with global technologies, I know neoliberalism is getting a very bad rap for working conditions and things like that, but it is the entire same process that manages to get vaccines to those who need it the most. We use the same supply chains, we use the same ports, right? We use the same system effectively. So I think that's a place where we can sort of focus our energies to lift the poor up. But I think absolutely the single answer I would give is immigration, right? Not enough of it.
So We have about 10 minutes. There's some great questions. I'm going to collapse a few of them, but there have been several in the following space. And I'll pose this, and Shruti, I'll actually start with you again. We'll make our way down this way again. So the starting question here quotes Balzac, so we have to include that, right? Behind every fortune lies a great crime. So the question is, should people who have amassed fortunes based on economic advantages they inherited that were historically derived from things like slavery forfeit some of that wealth to their historical victims? And then in the similar space of a question, another writes, in the US context, wealth is stratified along racial lines. How does that impact your stance? Now, Tom mentioned this before, but I think it's worth us surfacing and discussing a little bit more. The reality is racial differences have made a huge difference in the US context with who has been allowed to acquire wealth and the opportunities for wealth expansion. So how do we wrestle with the messy reality of historical sins and current structural injustices when trying to promote economic justice? And Shruti, we'll start with you.
I mean, so I didn't grow up in the United States, though I've lived here now for a long time. But it's the same in other parts of the world, right? I mean, I come from a world where there's the caste system. It still very much exists. It's entirely your life's fortunes are determined by your birth accident. So I think I wouldn't just limit this to American race relations. I would just extend this beyond that as a caveat. So I don't think that trying to repair certain historical injustices and having reparations or transfers for something very specific, I don't think that's incompatible with the market process and system that I've been talking about this entire time. I think, again, the question is, what is the misfortune or the criminal act that is being rectified, and then how clean and non-distortive that transfer is. For me, that's the part that matters as an economist. The first part matters morally. And I think that's where the big problem is not that there isn't the money. I think the big problem is there's a lack of consensus on what is the exact injustice that we're referring to and who ought to be the beneficiaries of rectifying that injustice. So I don't think that's antithetical to what I'm talking about. I mean, in various parts of the world, in India, for instance, there are massive affirmative action programs that exist in educational institutions, that exist in jobs, and so on. They've become quite important in creating what they call the Dalit middle class. But there's also great evidence that after the liberalization and the reforms in the 1990s, when India embraced a market system, we started getting the advent of Dalit millionaires, not just Dalit college-educated professors or bureaucrats, right? So there are many ways to solve for that, and I don't necessarily place weight on one being better than the other. But I don't see why that's not on the table, but the question is how we get consensus on how clean that transfer is.
Tom, please.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If you look at the 10 richest people in the world, the 10 richest Americans definitely, they are all white and they are all men. Does anyone think that's an accident? Does anyone think, as my colleague here has been implying, like echoing Nozick, that that's the result of voluntary transfer? No, of course not. It's the result of 500 years of slavery, colonialism, displacement, and patriarchy, right? So in this country, we have the Head Right Act, we have the Naturalization Act, we have the Land Ordinance Act, we have the Homestead Act, we have the Virginia Slave Codes. These are hundreds of years of racist law and economics. The economics can never be separated from the history. Racist law that is affirmative action for white people. A legal system designed to steal wealth from indigenous land and black bodies. That has gone all the way up to the GI Bill, to redlining, to Standing Rock today. So let me give you a contemporary example. So I live on Turtle Island, what settlers call Canada. Still going on right now, there is a pipeline being built through Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. This is land that there has never been a treaty on. Indigenous people have lived there forever. They've never signed it away. It's indigenous land by all rights, by any ethical legal theory. They've been sovereign there forever. Nevertheless, the Canadian government is forcing through a pipeline. That pipeline, CGL pipeline, is going to make millions of dollars for its shareholders. That is going to end up wherever it ends up, but it's large parts that are going to end up in the pockets of people like Taylor Swift. So how can anyone then turn around and say, I earned it, I deserve it, as if it's clean from the historical processes of colonialism and patriarchy and slavery that created that wealth? I think the only way you can do that is if you want to try to say that current capitalism has no injustices in it. That's, I think, a coherent argument, but I think it's a completely ahistorical and factually false one.
So we have 5 minutes for Jess and Ninha to present your final thoughts on this one. Yeah.
So I don't think even like your most like hardcore anarcho-capitalist or whatever, it's like right now current capitalism has no problems. And it's like, and nobody would ever say that the current distribution of resources has this like morally perfect genealogy. Of course, obviously, right? We can all name them many ways. Public officials have done a lot of really unjust things in the past, and they've facilitated private market actors to unjustly enrich themselves through these unjust laws about the distribution of land or about differential treatment when it comes to property rights or protection of the rule of law. And so yeah, there's been like long-standing political injustice, and that's affected the current distribution of resources right now. And in some cases, sure, maybe that merits some kind of a remedy. Although it is tricky because of the 980 problem, so I don't know. But given all of that, the question that we have at hand shouldn't necessarily be tracing specific historical injustices in the distribution and trying to like posit that there's like some kind of ideal perfect system of property rights that you could imagine. I think that the current thing that we should think about is how do we solve the real problems that people today are experiencing, often because of those historical legacies of injustices. And I think like step one is like stop the enduring injustices. So the injustices which persist to this very day, those are ones that we have like a very strong reason to just stop doing that. Like stop doing the bad historical injustices that we're still doing. So here's one, immigration restrictions. Immigration restrictions are like a restriction on people's economic freedom, their freedom to move labor across borders. Why do we have so many immigration restrictions? Why don't we let people come here, even though it would be good for us and good for them, where they can like sell their towns? Oh, it's democracy. It's that like people still have a bunch of really unjust attitudes today where they are trying to use the mechanisms of government to unjustly limit people's economic freedom and prevent them from getting the gains of capitalism and enriching themselves. So that's an ongoing injustice, which is being facilitated by people's inegalitarian attitudes by public officials by limiting people's economic freedom in ways that's immiserating poor people abroad. And there's many of these. And so no one's saying that the current distribution of property is like ideal, right? But what I'm saying is that putting it in the hands of public officials to try to remedy that distribution, I'm very skeptical because they've been so unreliable and they continue to be unreliable, as we can see by judging by their current approach to, like, for example, restrictions on free trade across borders and immigration restrictions.
No pressure, Ninha, but you have 1 minute to present your view and summarize everything.
No, good. No, so look, a lot of my discussion now has been sort of presenting different ways you might think about the problems and why not ask from this question, try to make these distinctions. And so I will somewhat continue in that vein, but try to share a little bit of an own sort of maybe personal journey, if that's helpful. A lot of our discussion has, I think, been predicated on the idea that can we figure out whether an individual deserves something or not. You know, and you know, this historical injustice question is a great question because it goes back to then, so okay, then how much was this person sort of negatively affected by things, and sort of how much can we make up for it? Or should they get something in return for it? I think that's kind of this, and we've been focusing in all of our conversation, I think, on roughly this kind of broadly individualistic approach to sort of thinking about things. Now, egalitarianism takes it a little bit further because it wants to look at sort of how people stand relative to one another. And relational egalitarianism, as Tom talks about, is also this idea of, well, maybe it matters in terms of how people stand in relation to others because it sort of affects us one way or the other. One thing that's been missing from our conversation is, I think, that whatever's happened in the past, we have to look for the future. And as we look to the future, the question is, how will we relate to one another? And I think this individualistic approach of trying to understand, well, what do we deserve or not deserve, or sort of make up for things or not, can only get you so far. And I'm reminded of an Ubuntu, the idea of Ubuntu, which some of you may be familiar with. It's sort of an African term from the social language. And it means roughly the idea that I am because you are, and we are because we can't be on our own at all. My existence depends upon your existence, and your existence depends upon my existence. And I wonder if we just, as a slight tweak, if we just make that slight tweak in thinking about things, would that sort of help shift us a little bit away from this kind of very individualist focus, which is nothing wrong with that, but I think there's something about that kind of broader recognition that we're all in this together. And I feel like sort of over time and in many years, that's where I've come to. I don't know what that means for how we think about these problems, but it does suggest for me a kind of a sort of a slight change in how we think about it. And you know, we've got a long way to go. We've done great in lots of ways, but maybe thinking slightly differently might be helpful too.
Would you please join me in thanking our panelists?
This was a marvelous panel. It had plot twists, it had isms that you've probably never heard before, and it had disagreement that was compassionate and passionate as well. And I want to remind students here that our 5 fellows wearing their vests will be up in the lobby, and they'll take you out to dinner in the square. So please take them for that. And most importantly, I just want to say thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.